Framlingham Castle sits high overlooking the spectacular and beautiful town of Framlingham in Suffolk. Today it's made famous by an Ed Sheeran song and is referred to as the Castle on the Hill. It's possibly one of the best castles I've ever visited, with its beauty being matched with intimidation and power. It's a remarkable room with an extremely interesting history, and today we'll explore this. So join us today as we look at Framlingham Castle and the story behind the Castle on the Hill. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following the Norman invasion, the population of the town of Framlingham rose drastically, and the region was owned by the powerful Hugh de Ranches, who was the Earl of Chester. During this time, a Motte Castle was first built on the site, in the 11th or early 12th century, as a place to house troops and as a means of instilling fear into the population. There's much dispute about the actual date of the construction of a castle at Framlingham, with some academics even suggesting that there was two castles built here, or that a castle was built on the site of an existing manor house. By the late 12th century, the Bigod family, whose descendants had been granted the land from the Earl of Chester, held significant influence in the Suffolk area. They held the title the Earl of Norfolk and owned 3 other major significant castles, but tensions would rise between the crown and the family. Hugh Bigod was a number of disobedient barons during the anarchy in the reign of King Stephen, and caused a number of problems and rebellions against the king. However, after the crowning of Henry II, the new king would try to re-establish the monarchy's power in the region. Because of this, Henry then confiscated the 4 castles owned by the Bigods, but later returned Framlingham on the payment of a huge fine of £666. Hugh would further revolt against Henry, attempting to overthrow him, and the king then ordered Framlingham to be destroyed. Roger, Hugh's son, would then regain favour when Richard I came to the throne, and set about building a new castle at the site, complete with 13 mural towers and a large inner court. At this time he also took advantage of a castle guard system, in which local land was given to local lords, in order to provide their knights and soldiers to guard the castle. Work on the castle was completed by the year 1213. Roger Bigod, with his now large fortification, would join the First Barons' War, and was one of the key opponents to King John, having argued against many of John's policies. John would flex his might by plundering Roger's land, and John would even arrive at Framlingham Castle in March 1216. The king's show of strength intimidated Roger into surrendering, with the castle's garrison of 26 knights, 20 sergeants, 7 crossbowmen, and a priest giving up the fortification. Roger would later go on to regain the castle, and during the 13th century saw many different expansions here. One of these was the Great Park, which was created around the castle and served as a hunting area, and later many other luxury renovations took place. Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl of Norfolk, in fact borrowed money from the Jewish community to add to his luxury abode, and would also find himself in debt to Edward I. Edward responded to the debt by seizing the castle, but agreeing with Roger that upon his death the fortification would pass to the crown. Edward II later gave Framlingham Castle to his half-brother the Earl of Norfolk, and at this time the castle was only partially finished. The castle however continued to thrive, and then was passed down through the Earl of Norfolk. As many as 83 people lived there at one time, and it supported the local economy heavily, with large amounts of food and drink being purchased for the household. In fact, in one year, over £1,000 was spent, a huge sum of money in them days, which included buying 70,000 loaves of bread, but also almost 29,000 gallons of ale. It's clear that the local area of Suffolk at the time in the 14th century was also a rather prosperous one. In 1476 the castle passed to John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and he began adding a different spin onto the castle. Under the Howard family, the castle would become modernised using fashionable brick to improve the structure, with ornamental chimneys also being added. The Howard family's hold over Framlingham is its most famous, and a great new chamber block was added to the inner court that linked the Great Hall with the chapel, and by 1524 there were at least 29 different rooms inside the castle, and possibly lots more. A drawbridge at the castle was replaced with a permanent bridge, and a pleasure garden was also built in the early 16th century, being a rather beautiful and fashionable space for the Howards to enjoy. Following losing the castle after the Battle of Bosworth and Henry VII's rise to the throne, Thomas Howard, the son of John, would regain the castle during Henry VIII's reign after his dad was killed at the battle. Framlingham became extremely lavishly decorated at this time, with huge tapestries lining the castle's walls, gold and silver fittings being added throughout the castle, and also many other luxuries added. The 3rd Duke of Norfolk, also called Thomas Howard, made less use of the castle. However, he was attainted in 1547 for supporting the claim of Mary I to the throne. Henry VIII died the day before Thomas was due to be executed at the Tower of London, but Mary's half-brother Edward VI gave him a last-minute reprieve, and he gave Framlingham to Mary, keeping Thomas in the Tower. Following Edward's death, a large problem arose about the next in line to the throne, with Lady Jane Grey initially being installed as the Queen of England. However, after just a matter of days, the rebellion behind her queenship stood down. It was at Framlingham Castle that Mary, the first daughter of Henry VIII to his wife Catherine of Aragon, would find out that she would become queen. It was in this castle that she would find out she would become Mary I, or later Bloody Mary as history has nicknamed her. She would then return to London to claim her throne, but in one of her first acts as queen, she would release Thomas Howard from the Tower of London and restore his estates and dukedom, giving Framlingham Castle back. By 1600, however, the castle was falling into disrepute, and it was even used as a prison to house 40 prisoners, including Roman Catholic priests, due to issues caused arising from the English Reformation. The Howard family would eventually collapse in its power, and their power across the region of Suffolk would become extinct by the 17th century. Framlingham Castle didn't play a prominent part in the English Civil War, and it escaped the slighting fate that occurred to many other English castles, seeing them blown up and ruined. The castle continued to fulfil different purposes and even became an isolation ward during an outbreak of the plague in 1666. A workhouse would be built inside the inner courts for the local poor to work in, so that they would be eligible for relief. However, it was closed due to being found to be unsatisfactory. Other parts of the castle would also be pulled down at this time, including the Great Hall. During the Napoleonic Wars, the castle would be used to house equipment for the local Framlingham Volunteer Regiment, and following the closure of the poorhouse, it was used as a county court and a local jail. Its strategic importance was considered during the Second World War, and at least one concrete pillbox was built nearby to counter a potential German invasion, and Nissen huts presumably used as soldiers' barracks were made inside of the bailey. Let's now have a look specifically inside and out at the different parts of the castle. The inner bailey at Framlingham is remarkable. It's a huge area which would have encapsulated many different buildings in the castle's lifetime. However, today, noticeably, only the workhouse seems to remain. You are taken into the castle under the gatehouse and enter a huge space, but instantly notice the number of different towers that are here. There are 13 in total, and all served for different purposes and had different roles inside of the castle. The curtain wall has a wall walk built into it, which is great for tourists today to get fantastic views. However, this would have been a fantastic way for guards and archers to move quickly around the castle, hiding behind the crenellations on top. The wall walk also has access in the Tudor times to various different chambers built up into the towers. As said before, the towers would have had different purposes, such as living quarters for the Howard family, guest apartments and also other rooms. In Tower 6 there is the most recognisable Tudor influence, with the brick being warmer than the stone used, and this tower preserves the best Tudor remains from the period. The room built here was reached by a stone spiral staircase on the wall walk. Its fireplace was topped with an ornate brick chimney, and a large window would have looked out onto the pristine gardens below. Inside these rooms would have been extravagant tapestries and carpets, velvet curtains and incredible grandeur. In fact, Thomas Howard, the contemporary of Henry VIII, would write about his own great hanged bed, played with cloth of gold, white damask and black velvet. Also around this area is the remains of the chapel inside the castle. This was found beneath the Tudor room, and you can see where it was built into the wall. The chapel would have been for the residents of the castle, and they had their own private ceremonies here throughout the week. It's a shame none of this remains today. It would have been the focal point of life inside the fortification, and also would have been richly decorated. A tapestry of Christ's Passion hung on the walls, and another embroidery hung behind the altar showing the crucifixion. The 2nd Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, was laid out here after his death, for his family to come and visit before his funeral procession. The castle's main living quarters were inside the chamber block, built in the 12th century, that served the lord and his family. The building was 2 stories high, and heated with a large fireplace on each floor. A timber hall could have stood nearby also and served as a reception space. The chamber block was built by Hugh Bigod around 1190, and it continued to house private rooms as time went on. Tradition states that Mary I stayed there in 1553, and it was refurbished before her visit. The Great Hall was also placed here nearby, and would have been twice as wide as the workhouse that sits on its site today. It was a rather large building and would have been a place of great grandeur, where the owners could have entertained their guests, which would have sometimes included royalty. Private chambers were also added to the north, as a place to withdraw to after dinner, and it would have been incredibly lavishly decorated. An inventory in 1524 tells of tapestries with beasts and men upon them hanging on the walls. As well as the brick buildings, a number of other buildings would have littered this area. Today you look from above and you don't really get a sense of a crowded inner bailey, however many different buildings did cover this area. In the earlier medieval period, wooden buildings would have lined the castle's walls to serve the castle's owner. During the Tudor period, brick buildings lined the walls and crossed the castle's court to make it feel more enclosed. Between the hall and the chapel, in fact, would have been a number of large stone chambers facing the front gate. However, today, none of this remains. These chambers would have served as reception areas for arrivals visiting the castle, and they were also richly decorated. There would have also been a pantry, a buttery and a wine cellar around here, as well as the kitchens, which today are incredibly easy to miss as their remains are simply tiny. There would have also been a huge armoury, which contained over 100 suits of armour and a huge amount of arrows for the guards, should they need to defend the castle. There would have also been stables inside the inner bailey, big enough for 30 horses, but today, like many of the buildings, hardly anything remains. Imagine how this castle would have looked with all these different areas still standing, and it would have been absolutely colossal inside. The workhouse, which today houses the entrance to the wall walk, was built in 1729 using stone from the original Great Hall. It was a residential workhouse where the extremely poor had to live and work in return for receiving poor relief. Different rooms would be designated for different industries such as spinning, weaving or cobbling. The workhouse closed in 1839, and this area was then used for local courts. Outside the castle you can see a number of defensive elements to the fortification, such as its huge curtain walls, but also a large ditch in front of it. The stone curtain walls which are seen today were probably built around 1190, and it's around 10.5 metres high and 2.3 metres thick, made from local flint and septoria found in East Anglia. The crenellations on top of the battlements also add to a formidable impression of the castle. The ditch in front, however, is incredibly deep. This was built as the main defensive element for the castle, as well as a motte or a hill where the castle sits upon. The banks of the ditch are incredibly steep, and should the castle have been attacked, then the archers, who could walk a full 360 degrees of the castle, could rain terror and arrows down onto the attackers, creating a bloodbath. Beyond the walls of the castle would have been access to the Great Park, which was primarily used by the owner and guests as a place to hunt for entertainment. You'd expect to find pheasants, partridges, deers and hares here, all which would have been hunted for sport. Also, there's the remains in the ditch of the Tudor bridge which spanned out from the castle. This would have been a private gateway which would have taken the owners into their own private garden across the ditch. The huge stone western tower that protrudes from the curtain wall protected the castle from attacks from the west. It was built along with the other stone parts in around 1190, and its high walls would have forced attackers through a tight entrance, which could have been defended from above by arrows raining down, or could have formed a murder hole. The western tower is also often called the prison tower, and the deep pit in front may have served as a dungeon, which would have been incredibly cold. Criminals that were housed here would have been thieves, lollards and religious prisoners. There were beautiful gardens found in front of the lower court, which would have been landscaped in the 16th century and featured fruit trees, herbs and fountains. Guests could take a stroll to the edge of the mere that's nearby and relax in this area too. The mere is estimated to be over 3,000 years old and was used to provide the castle with fresh fish such as trout, tench, bream and perch. Also, plants that grew alongside the mere were interestingly used for food, but also in different medicines. So overall, Framlingham Castle may be known as the castle on the hill, but it has a uniquely interesting story. Its striking appearance and dominating structure stands tall above the beautiful town of Framlingham, however its history is extremely interesting. One thing, however, I do wish is that many of the buildings that were once standing inside the inner bailey were still around for us to explore and delve deeper into the different purposes of the rooms. Overall, however, it's a fantastic place to visit, has a rich story in which saw it entrenched with a family with key links to royalty, and it certainly is one of England's best castles. Once again, thank you for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Once again, thank you for watching.